We haven't even seen the results of the Chilcot inquiry into the last one, but Britain is yet again at war in Iraq. Even as the number of civilian casualties, many women and children, grow ever higher, David Cameron isn't even ruling out an expanded war in Syria. With me is our former ambassador to Sudan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan, Sir William Patey. He's now at the private consultancy Controlled Risks and is a non-executive director of HSBC Middle East. Welcome, Sir William, to Going Underground. We're at war yet again. You gave evidence to the Chilcot inquiry into the last war. Why do you think we haven't got the result?
Why Chilcot hasn't reported is a matter for Chilcot. I know there's some problems over release of correspondence between President and Prime Ministers. Those correspondence always remain privileged, so I'm sure we'll get a report in due course, but I doubt it will tell us anything we don't already know.
But some people might argue we are at war again, and the inquiry into the last one hasn't even been released. It seems a bit strange.
Well, some people might argue it's a continuation of the last one, or dealing with some of the consequences of the last one. I think the reality is it's different what we're facing at the moment. We're facing a terrorist threat. We're facing an existential threat to some of our allies in the region, and some of the residual problems created by the last conflict in Iraq are having to be dealt with now. But we've got a government in Iraq, an elected government in Iraq, who's asking for help. And that's what's being provided. I don't think we've taken responsibility for this war. We're assisting our local allies.
Politicians, including the Maliki government, including Maliki himself, who's democratically elected, before he was deposed for the latest president, they were warning the West, weren't they, that these groups were taking over regions and there was fertile ground there for their ideology. Why did Washington and London not respond then? Why did we not even help them out when they asked for airstrikes back a year ago, maybe?
Well, I think the problem then was there was no political strategy, and Maliki had created the circumstances which had alienated the Sunni population of Iraq.
Maliki or Britain?
Well, Maliki's in charge of the country. I think, as a British ambassador in many of these countries, I spent a lot of time trying to explain our past mistakes. But our past mistakes are our past mistakes. The people who are responsible for running Iraq now are the Iraqis. And Maliki's pursuit of moderate Sunni politicians created circumstances, I think, in which the Sunnis felt alienated. So hopefully the new government of Iraq, of Haider al-Abadi, can reach out to the Sunnis and can isolate the extremists, isolate ISIS, because without such a political strategy, whatever we do militarily will ultimately fail.
Now, when you were ambassador to Iraq, you said that you got nearly daily briefings from Number 10. Do you think the current ambassador is getting that at the moment? Well, and did David Cameron know previously that the Iraqi parliament was clamoring for help way before ISIS made all these huge military advances?
Well, I think the circumstances are very different. When I was ambassador, we had 10,000 troops on the ground. There were 100,000 American troops. Iraq was in the process of political transformation. It was having a new constitution. So I think the circumstances are different. We didn't have any troops in Iraq. The Iraqi government had been elected. We'd had the third election in Iraq. So it's fair to say that matters were in the hands of the Iraqis much more than they were when I was ambassador. Lots of people were warning the Maliki government. It's not a case of the Iraqi parliament warning the West that something was happening. People were warning.
They did. Politicians said they were taking
they might have been, but the
North.
responsibility was Maliki's. The Maliki government was responsible for driving out the Sunni Vice President Tariq al-Hashimi, for driving out the Sunni Minister of Finance Ravat al-Asawi. So, if the alienation of the Sunni community is a factor in ISIS's success, I think the blame can be laid fairly at the door of the Maliki government and not the West. Or
if we forget the history of the Ba'athist
well, yeah, you can always go
when
we go back to history.
That wasn't that long ago. Yeah. Okay, well, 6 tornadoes are flying back and forth from Cyprus. You've said that you think they'll help to free up US forces in Syria. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the debate was about where would Britain participate, and the permission from the Parliament is for doing operations in Iraq, not in Syria. But the reality is it's one campaign, and British participation will be coordinated with the other allies and the Americans. So if we're only able to operate in Iraq, then that would inevitably free up American operations in Syria.
And do you think David Cameron and the intelligence services are aware that, I mean, only within a few days we've had reports of civilian casualties that are, of course, reverberating around the Arab world. Again, the imperialists are there. At the same time, we've seen al-Nusra, which have been fighting ISIS, now back in the fold with ISIS. Do you think this was all foreseen when these decisions are being made in Washington and in London?
Well, there'll be people who want to exploit the fact that the so-called imperialists are there, but let's remember they're there at the invitation of an elected Iraqi government. They're there at the request of the Kurds.
Do you get the impression of looking at it that it's being seen as this imperialist war? If we've allied already all these opposition groups together against the coalition, as it were,
some people will see it as an imperialist war because that will suit them. But the reality is that we've been asked to help. We don't have any imperial ambitions in Iraq or Syria. The days of Sykes-Picot are long gone. I mean, what we do want is stability, and we don't want terrorists to again capture territory and have a safe haven as they had in Afghanistan and they have in other places. So there's a strong national security imperative for Britain and for others to help our allies in the region. But let's not pretend that this is some sort of imperialist adventure.
Of course, some are arguing that this is deliberately, it was a plan, as it were, by ISIS to draw the West in. Who do you think benefits from the tornadoes going into Iraq? Because I know, I mean, obviously people in Iran benefit, obviously President Assad benefits. How does Britain benefit?
Well, I mean, the people who benefit immediately, I was in Erbil in Kurdistan a few weeks after ISIS was on the doorstep, and they were clearly being outgunned. The Kurds were being outgunned, artillery. They didn't have the means to counter some of the weaponry that ISIS had. So there's no doubt that airstrikes has helped local Iraqis to defend themselves against ISIS. But there's undoubtedly ISIS would like to provoke some sort of narrative that there's a general confrontation between the West and Islam, and of course it's important to counter that narrative and to conduct ourselves in a way that belies it. But ISIS is killing Muslims, not just Yazidis, not just Christians. They're killing Muslims. They're attacking the Syrian opposition. They're attacking ordinary Iraqis.
Which just goes to show how, despite the fact that most of the deaths by ISIS are Muslims, they can still exploit a narrative against the West, how bad things are. I think I want to get on to Saudi Arabia, because you were an ambassador to Saudi. When you were there, did you know that the people around you at your meetings were funding what would become ISIS?
Well, there's lots of accusations made against Saudi and the Saudi government and what they've been funding. I know from my dealings with the Saudi government at the time that they were very hard on terrorist organisations. We have close cooperation. The British government had close cooperation.
To your face, or underneath it there was finance? Because where is the financing coming from if it's not Saudi Arabia?
Well, I mean, most of the financing for ISIS has been coming from internally generated means. If you look at the financing, some of it is kidnapping and ransom. A lot of it's taxation.
Nowadays, now that they've taken the size of Britain.
$400 million in the central bank in Mosul.
But in your day?
In my day, there could have been possible that individual Saudis and individual Emiratis and Gulfis were funding groups. Now, there was a complication in Syria because we were all funding the anti-Assad opposition, and the Saudis were funding some of the opposition who've turned out who've joined ISIS subsequently, but they weren't funding ISIS at the time. They were funding the anti-Assad opposition, and one of the difficulties of that was, finding the right people. And
moderate rebels, and we're still trying to find those. Actually, in your day, it was more Al-Qaeda, wasn't it? I mean, you were meeting with Saudi officials, and then underneath it, of course, there have been big changes in the staff of the royal family when it comes to foreign policy. But British officials were meeting these guys, and then underneath, they were funding.
Yeah, well, you see, I don't accept that. We had a good relationship with the Ministry of Interior and Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, and there was no evidence. We never found any evidence that the Saudi government had any interest in funding terrorist organisations. And for them, Al-Qaeda is a threat to them, existential threat to them, and ISIS is a threat to them. Now, they may have been funding groups with our knowledge that had a sort of jihadi flavour, if you like, and things have got more complicated and they were certainly anti-Assad. And that would all have been done in cooperation with Britain. So I know there's a lot of people who just repeat. One journalist says it, and then another one repeats it, and it becomes a fact. I mean, nobody has shown me any evidence whatsoever of Saudi government involvement in funding ISIS, and I would be shocked and surprised if that were the case, because ISIS threatens Saudi Arabia as much as it threatens the United Kingdom.
No doubt about it, but of course I think suspicions are raised because President Obama promised the 28 pages redacted from the 9/11 Commission report would be released. They haven't been. Everyone assumes that shows Saudi involvement.
Well, I mean, nobody doubts that Saudis were involved, individual Saudis were involved in the 9/11. But the idea that the Saudi government was somehow...
Well, why did they redact the... We'll have to find out whether they're ever released.
You need a much longer programme for me to rebut every Middle East conspiracy theory I've had over the last 30 years.
OK, well, right now...
When there's a conspiracy or a cock-up, it's usually a cock-up, not a conspiracy. Conspiracies are really hard to conduct.
I wonder how embarrassing those 28 pages must be. 6 tornado aircraft, they're flying from Cyprus right now. A thought experiment, actually not a thought experiment, it probably will happen. Say it on a reconnaissance flight, it sees Syrian troops being attacked in a battle with ISIS militants. Who do we bomb?
Well, we won't be bombing the Syrian troops. Britain won't be bombing anybody in Syria because Britain's operations are confined to Iraq. So that's a simple question for British tornadoes until in such time as probably there was a Security Council resolution, because the Labour opposition have said they wouldn't support.
So when the reconnaissance information is handed to the Americans, they are facilitating it. Which way did the Americans?
I'd be pretty confident.
Bomb both sides?
I think they'd be bombing ISIS.
President Assad, de facto ally now?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've said all along that we need to look at this in who's the greater enemy, and I have said that I'm pretty confident that there must be some form of information passing between the Allies and the Assad regime to avoid any mishaps, because if the Syrians were to knock down an American plane, then that would have more profound consequences, and I don't think they'll want to do that. So I imagine there's a degree of collaboration going on. Now, it's very difficult for any Western government to accept that they're dealing with an Assad regime that they have so roundly condemned for using chemical weapons against its own people for all sorts of reasons. But, you know, if Kissinger was around, and I'm a real politician too, the time has probably come to be reopening the dialogue between the Assad regime and the non-ISIS Syrian opposition, because I think they have a common enemy. We all have a common enemy. And it may be possible to come to a different political solution in Syria that excludes ISIS, that isn't a return to the status quo ante with the Assad regime, but doesn't involve a complete overthrow of the Assad regime. I think that's worth exploring.
Sir William Patey, thank you.
A pleasure.